Please welcome Karl O'Keefe.
Hey, evening. Wow, it's very bright up here. Let's see. Can we get my slides up? Is that something we can do? Oh, yay! Cool. All right. First, me. I'm Karl O'Keefe. I'm a senior front-end developer at Geckoboard. Geckoboard is a company and a product. We do dashboards for TVs, so these guys will be perfect. And you chuck up kind of your important metrics for your company, make them visible to the rest of the company. That's me, that's the company. So today I'm going to be talking about React Storybook. And the talk is going to cover two areas. So the first one is what is Storybook? It's an idea and it's an open source project, and then I will go on and explain some of the benefits that we've found in using Storybook at Geckoboard. So if you've never heard of Storybook before, it's, as a concept, it gives you a space, it gives you a place where you can develop and test your user interface components in isolation. There's many ways to implement that, but there is also an open source project called Storybook, and you can find that at getstorybook.io. So this is Storybook. This is the open source version of Storybook. It's fairly simple. You have a panel on the right-hand side, and that's where your component goes. And then on the left-hand side, you have a menu, a number of sections, and then within each section, you have a number of states, a number of different components to test. This is separate from your main app, so it runs as a separate process and it spins up its own URL. And it gives you really strict isolation from the rest of your code. You're testing just your components on their own, just feeding in props and getting the resulting output. You won't have any of your the rest of your scaffolding, none of your data, none of your Flux Redux layer. This one is the open source project. You can download this and use it and spin it up really quickly. So if you did want to use Storybook, how would you go about doing that? So it's pretty simple, really. We start out with just creating a story.js file, and you'd normally host that in the same location as your components. So similarly to where you'd normally store your tests in the same directory as your components, you'd do the same for the story. You can kind of think of the story as like a visual set of tests for your components. So when you spin up Storybook, it will look through your project and it will find all of the story.js files, and it will use that to compile a storybook and to build the left-hand menu for you. What else to say with that? Well, maybe how do we build it? What does the code look like? So it's fairly simple, really. You import Storybook into one of your story files. You say, what's the section name? And then you give a name to your story. And then you just have a function, and it needs to return the component to be rendered. So you can write that out with JSX, you pop in all the props you want to display, and then Storybook will render that. You can add multiple examples in one file. So here where I have the .add refresh interval picker, I can have .add refresh interval picker with no intervals or 100 intervals, and I'll get extra examples in Storybook. So that's a super quick run through of Storybook. It lets you create your components and display them in isolation from the main app. It's very easy to create stories, co-host them with your components, and have the storybook automatically generated. You just return the JSX of the components you want to display. So we use this at Geckoboard, but at Geckoboard we're not using the open source version of Storybook. So we've built our own version of Storybook at Geckoboard. That's not because there's any problem with the open source version. It was just that it was much easier for us to integrate our Storybook into our build and deploy process by writing it ourselves. It is possible using the open source Storybook to compile it into a standalone app and host it. Unfortunately, at Geckoboard, we still have chunks of global CSS, and hosting those in a separate Storybook app was difficult, so we pulled Storybook into our code base and deploy it as part of our standard deploy for the app. So this is one of the reasons I wanted to bring up the idea that Storybook is an idea or a concept, giving you a space to test your components in isolation. You can use the open source Storybook. It took about a day for us to write a basic version of Storybook in our own code base to get those same advantages. So I've kind of covered Storybook as an idea, and that we use it at Geckoboard. And I wanted to go through, for the rest of this talk, some of the benefits that we at Geckoboard have found from using Storybook. So there's 4 main areas I want to cover that I'm going to talk about this evening. And the first one is a feedback loop. This is something I'm super passionate about as a developer. The faster I and the rest of my team can get feedback on our code changes, the higher quality of the code we output, the faster we can make changes, the better a product we make. That's my belief. So to show you kind of the improved feedback loop, I am going to try and do a live demo. So we will see how this goes. Okay, so here we can see this is the Geckoboard version of Storybook, and this is running locally. So this is the experience I would have as a developer. And then on the right-hand side is my code base, and I have running on a terminal. I have our Webpack build and watch and hot module reloading system running in the background. So I'm viewing on the left-hand side our button component, and I can see the different types. We have primary, secondary, negative, and link buttons. I can see the disabled state. I can see what they look like when they're rendered with an anchor tag as opposed to a button tag. So I can see, say, 12 different states of my button here. And now I want to make some changes to the code, and let's see what does this button look like if I make it more exciting and I put a little ta-da in. And so my editor auto saves, Webpack pulls in the changes and injects those straight into Storybook. It's kept my scroll position in the page, and it's updated all the React components automatically. So this allows you to test tweaks you would make to the button, and you can test 10 or 12 different variants of a component at once. Without Storybook, if you would imagine, okay, well, how would I do this? I would probably make a tweak to the code, then I would reload the app. That might need to make some network requests, and then it would load the app, and then I would find, oh, I know there's a primary button here, and if I go in to delete my account, I'll see a negative button, and the secondary buttons here. And I have to go and find those and look at them one by one. Storybook brings those components to me and gives me auto-updated feedback. In our case, it takes about 1.5 seconds to do a build and inject the code into Storybook. So that's what I mean by a faster feedback loop. I can see multiple variations updated within a couple of seconds without having to leave the context of my editor. Okay, I am very glad the demo went with no explosions. Can I get back into full screen mode? Hey, cool. So that was the demo. Some of the things I mentioned in the demo, I just wanted to go through again. So you get multiple variations of your component visible at once. You don't have to go and search out where that component is used. You don't have to go and search out where that component is used across the app. It all comes to you. The other one is there's no network request. So if you did have to go to the app to check something, in the case of Geckoboard, we want to load a dashboard. We've got to go to the Geckoboard servers to get the data. Potentially, if we don't have the data cached, we're going to go and make API requests to third parties before we can show the results. So you might be waiting 5, 10 seconds for a result. The final one is something that once you have it, I feel you could never go back, and that's having hot reloading. So here, as soon as I made the changes in my editor, those changes are injected straight into Storybook. It keeps your scroll position, it keeps the state of any component, so if you have text in inputs or drop-downs that are open, any state inside your React components is kept. So you get to test variations or tweaks to your component and keep the context exactly the way you want. Okay, so that's one benefit, is faster feedback. Next benefit I want to talk about is something that we found really useful at Geckoboard and we hadn't thought we would, and that's using Storybook as a visual testing tool and a visual regression testing tool. So here is a very simple Geckoboard dashboard with one chart, and at Geckoboard we provide a whole range of charts, so line charts and column charts. You can change the axes on them. They can be numbers, they can be times, they can be durations, they can be dates. They can be dates from kind of dates and times from milliseconds up to years. And we want our charts to be able to handle that large volume of data. But that means when we want to make a change to a chart, how do we test that? And before Storybook, you would make a change, you would go to your dashboard with an example chart, you would reload, you would wait for the data to come in, maybe 3 or 4 seconds, and check that it looks good. And maybe you want to say, okay, but how does it look with numbers? So maybe you make another chart, or you go in and edit this chart. And it's an okay process, but it's a little bit slow. You've lost that fast feedback. How does it work with Storybook? So when I worked on updating the charts last year, I was like, I will put a lot of example charts into Storybook. And so here, this one is testing how does a column chart look with all the different variations of x-axes that we have. So maybe they're dates, numbers, maybe it's just text for each category. And you can scroll down through here and just check how does this look at various different sizes with different amounts of data. And it gives you a lot of variations again all in one place. There's a few other unintended benefits. So once this work was done, all of these variations were checked in to source control as a story file and immediately available to all the other developers. So when another developer needed to make another tweak to the axes a few weeks later, he had a full test suite that covered all of the different cases. Previously, we hadn't had that, as any dashboard you made would be personal to your Geckoboard account. And then finally, another favorite of mine again, hot reloading meant that if you had scrolled through these examples and you'd found something you needed to tweak, you'd change your code, hot reloading would update that component in place, and your scroll position would be kept exactly where it was. So you could work on chunks of these examples without interference, without losing your place. So for x-axis, we ended up with 135 different permutations of the axes. So that's the what types do we support on the axes, what size is the widget, how much data is there, how many ticks, how many data points. I could fit 1/6 of the examples on this page. So that gives you an idea of the scope of this, and we found it worked really well kind of as a regression testing tool. You make a tweak, you scroll through this big list, and thankfully the human brain is very good at spotting things that are unusual or different, so you didn't have to kind of look at everyone exactly. You scrolled through and you could pick out unusual things. So Storybook worked really well for us as a visual testing tool. The third benefit I'd like to mention is Storybook as documentation. So again, this wasn't something we set out to have initially with Storybook, but it grew out of our use of Storybook. And that's, as we saw with the button page, kind of using Storybook not just as a testing tool or a place to view a component, but as documentation for our basic components. So our button page has the examples, but it also has some descriptions of how you would use a button, the different cases you would use a primary or a negative button, and some kind of explanation of what this component does and how you might use it. And this is really useful when onboarding new developers, and even as we found with our kind of quick daily, multi-daily deploys, it's very easy for one developer to create a component and move on, and another developer a week later needs the same thing, but they don't know the first component has been created. Storybook gave us a place to put components and document them, and it became a kind of a go-to resource for, I need a simple basic component. Does it exist yet? Well, I'll have a look in Storybook, and that will show me, and if it does exist, I can see how to configure it, and I can see if it's suitable for my needs. So as well as the basic documentation, we also had a couple of nice tweaks. So one of them is the Storybook would automatically kind of introspect the components and find their prop types, and then build a table of prop types for each component. And this table, as it currently is fairly simple. It can tell you the name of the prop type, it can tell you the type, so is it a Boolean or a string? If it's one of a number of values, it can tell you what those possible values are, and if there's a default, it can tell you what the default is. So this starts to become a slightly more in-depth documentation, and because it pulls it from the React prop types, and the code is checked in the same repository as the source code, you know it's always up to date. So using Storybook as documentation is something that has been increasing in Geckoboard. We only started about 5 months ago, and we're slowly adding more and more of our base components in. The last benefit I wanted to talk about, I couldn't think of a fancy name for this, so it's larger components. And what I mean by that is kind of the opposite of the documentation. So the documentation is showing for our small, really reusable components, how do they work? Show me all of the examples. This one is saying we have a large chunk of our functionality, a large chunk of our UI, and it would still be valuable to have that in the Storybook to get most of those kind of fast feedback benefits that I discussed initially. So one example of this is our customization panel for a dashboard. So this is where you can change the colors of things, upload logos, turn on and off footers. This panel displays differently based on the plan that you've purchased. So if you're on a starter plan, you have limited access to the functionality. If you're on a growth or a company plan, you get full access to the functionality. So testing that as before Storybook would mean needing to log in one browser as a user with a certain plan, either logging in a different browser as another user, or in an incognito window, or logging in and out to go back and forth to compare the different versions. So it's a little bit of extra work to say, well, how does this whole chunk of UI work when I have a different plan or there's some chunk of state that is different? So here's an example where I have access to everything. And in this case, I'm on a starter plan, and I don't know if you can see in the slides, but there's little kind of tooltips, little bubbles have appeared next to some of the options, and there's just the beginning of a kind of a light grey box at the bottom that's explaining which functionality you have access to and which ones you don't. So by putting this in Storybook, you get one scrollable page. If you're on a much bigger monitor, you can see two of these side by side, and you can see how whole chunks of your UI change based on some of the kind of deeper settings in your app, without having to go and either load up multiple browsers to get those states or to navigate through and change complex settings in the app. So this is something we found beneficial. It's something we've only quite recently started doing, so we have no idea how far to push this. My approach is keep pushing it until it breaks, put more and more of the app in here, and have it configured by Storybook and give you a single place to test stuff. There's some difficulties that we found with this. So first one is, we had this working. We had our customize component in Storybook with multiple variations, and it was great. And then one of the developers added a component down the kind of the hierarchy, one of the child components, 3 or 4 levels deep, and wrapped that in a Redux Connect so that it could pull some information from the store to decide how to render itself. And suddenly, the whole customized UI could no longer be displayed in Storybook because there was no Redux store. Similar problems if you have a component and it wants to use a link component. So if you use React Router and you say, yeah, I'm going to have links for navigating between my different URLs, those link components expect a context object to be available on the history, and when it's not, they blow up. So as you start trying to include more components and larger chunks of functionality in Storybook, you're likely to hit these cases where some of your child components want something from state or from context or some other part of your app. We've seen the benefit already of having this larger functionality in, so we searched for some solutions to this and came across something that seems to be working well for us. So we have created a couple of providers, we call them, a Storybook state provider and a Storybook history provider. And you can wrap your Storybook story in these, and they will ensure that the correct context objects are available for your child components. This has worked really well for us because we use Redux for all our state, and we use React Router for routing, and those are the only 2 places any of our code goes to get external information, and by external I mean information that doesn't come from its props. So if we can control those 2 places in Storybook, we can control all of the data that a component will need to render. So this really simple example here, we set the URL so that this is the mock URL that our history provider will say the page is being rendered at, and we will put in our Redux state. So in this simple example, it's just saying, here is the plan that this user is on. So they're on a trial plan, or a starter, or a growth. And you can change that per example. So you can have multiple examples on the page. They'll all get wrapped in a different state provider and a different history provider. Providing a URL for the history provider means that link components can correctly show whether they are active, that is, whether they've matched that URL or not. So that's something that seems to be working well for us. It's something we've only started doing recently, but it was fairly simple to get up and running, and it now allows us to put larger chunks of functionality in our Storybook app that makes it easier to test things that require different state, and state that can be cumbersome to set up in the app. So that's moving to a different plan, or is my user an admin, or a read-only user, or a limited access user. So those are the 4 areas I wanted to talk about. So it's Storybook giving you that really fast feedback loop. So no network requests, hot reloading, multiple variations on the page at once. It's Storybook giving you a place to do visual testing and regression testing. So that, for us, was showing hundreds of variations of our chart components in a single place, submitted into source control, and that's a huge suite of tests for developers who need to work on those components. Documentation for our kind of small, more atomic chunks of components, the really reusable stuff, great for onboarding new developers and spreading knowledge between the team. And then the final one that we're still getting to grips with in Storybook is chucking bigger and bigger components in there and providing more than just props. We're providing state from Redux and state from the URL. That's what we have so far, and we're finding it very useful. We have some ideas of where we can take this in the future. So one of those would be to spin out or spin up the documentation to be a much more fully featured chunk of documentation. So if you've seen nicer kind of component libraries, even something simple like Bootstrap, there's a lot more detail and examples in there, and there's often code snippets that you can copy and paste. And that's something we're currently missing and we'd love to put in. So every example would have a little button next to it, and you can press that, grab the code snippet, copy and paste it straight into your editor. With the visual testing, we have these hundreds of tests for our charts, but they're all currently manual. We have investigated, but we haven't moved to production yet, automatically running image-based regression tests over those. So our acceptance test suite would load up Storybook, take a screenshot, cut an image out for every component on the page, and then every time something is checked into master, it will run that same check again, and it can let you know if something has changed. We think potentially there is value in that. Little bit worried that it would mean that every time you change a chart, you have 300 tests break. So we'd like to give it a go. We don't know whether it will be really useful or it will be too much noise. Finally, with the last part I talked about of larger kind of chunks of components and providing them with Redux state, we're still getting started with that, but I can imagine as we do that more, we'd potentially want to extract out how we provide that state so that we're not recreating whole chunks of our state tree in every single story, because then if we change how we organize our state, that's a whole lot of stories to update. So potentially we would want one single place that would give us our Redux state for tests that was configurable, but gave us one place to update our state tree if we do change it. Okay, that is everything I wanted to talk about. you can see our storybook at Geckoboard, so it's at app.geckoboard.com/storybook. It's available publicly, so you can see the kind of component documentation we have, the example tests for our charts, and a whole range of other components that we've put in, and people just chuck a few examples in there because it's useful while developing the components. So you can see, hopefully, examples of all the things I talked about, and that's something we find very beneficial without having used it for kind of all of our components. What's up there has easily been worth the effort so far. Okay, are there any questions? And if there are any questions, would you like to come up to the microphone in the middle so we can hear you?
I think you've been pretty succinct.
Does that mean it was either really good or really bad?
Just incredibly informative. Well, please thank Karl for us. Thank you very much.